Hello, welcome to my sprint update video number 3. First, I'm going to talk about our division of work over the last sprint. Next, I'm going to demo our new features of our application. Then I'm going to go onto GitHub and highlight some of the new code and challenges that I faced over the last sprint. And finally, I'm going to go onto Team Gantt and talk about the previous sprint features that I assigned myself and the next sprint features that I plan to work on for the next 2 weeks. Without further ado, let's get into it. So first of all, this is our division of work. I, for the most part, worked on the calendar screen and the pod management screen. Alexis worked on the create account screen. Isaiah, the add meal plan screen. Brandon, the forget password screen. And Max, more on the login page and the welcome screen. And you'll see those design changes in our demonstration right now. So right here, this is our What's for Dinner application. If I go ahead and sign in, I can choose to forget a password. I'm using a fake email right now, so demonstrating that won't be super helpful, but I'll go ahead and sign in and show you the rest of the features. And here we are, it navigated us to the calendar screen. Now we have a list of meal pods on our calendar: family, youth group, and college fam. If I go ahead and click into any of these, it will take you to the management screen for that particular meal pod, with some extra buttons in the future for editing the pod and managing its members, and a save button to navigate back. That is hard-coded for all of these buttons. But I will plan to update that in the future. Down here is Isaiah's changes with the new meal plan screen, adding that to the calendar. And on the right here is just demonstrating that the application is retrieving info from our Firestore database. I just haven't implemented displaying it yet. That's about it for our demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and get into the GitHub commits. So I've highlighted here 2 main merges that I added. This will also be reflected in our on the Gantt chart. I'm going to go ahead and get into the first one here. So the main changes here focus around the design of the calendar. First of all, I needed screens to navigate from the calendar to. So I created 2 pod management screens, one for when we'll have to create a new pod in the future, and another for when we are editing currently displayed meal pods. And I add those to our stack navigator. On our calendar screen, I had to use something known as a flat list right here, which takes in 3 parameters: data, render item, and your key extractor. Your data is basically an array, so that it knows how many entries in the list there are. Your render item, so what does it render for each item that's in that list? So for my case, it's a button. And the key extractor, what do you basically pass in that you want the render button, the render item to know? And for our button, I wanted it to know the item, which in our test data right here, each of these entries is an item. And I basically want each button to know the name of the item, because that's what we're displaying here. So for instance, this is College Fam. You saw that in the demo. Then for every single button, we handle for when it's pressed, which will take us again to the same pod management screen. In the future, I'll want to pass in the actual pod information from Firestore, but for now, it's got to be hard-coded, because I'm not quite there yet. And some general styles here. This is the pod management screen for editing a meal pod, and this is just general styling and looks. Same for when we create a new pod for the pod management screen. And my next merge, this is more focused on the back end. So how does our application actually retrieve this information? And our mindset is that we want to use the user's information to find out if they are a member or an admin of any existing meal pod. If we find that association or any more member or admin associations, we can use those to retrieve whatever meal pods that our user has joined. So right here, we get the current user's ID, and we can use the current user's ID to get their member associations. What we do is we query, so using .where, we query a member based on their current user ID, because every member has a user ID, every admin has a user ID. A member or an admin is just a way that we can link a meal pod to a user, and a user can be either a member or an admin. And so we have to do that separately for admins since they are also their own object. But regardless, we query based on the user ID. And because queries return an array, we have to snapshot everything, every individual item that's returned from the query. And so for each document in the snapshot, we want to make sure it exists. And if it does, then we can successfully retrieve it and print it. Once that's done, we can use the admin ID or the member ID to get the meal pod that the user's associated with. So getting it from the admin ID is the purpose of this function. I will have a separate one for getting it from the member ID. And then right here again is just some general styling, like the divider, the dividing line between the header and the body, and some general things like that. And this is where I hard-coded the information for the pod management screen. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and get into Team Gantt, where those two merges fall under these two tasks I have assigned right here. So we have our calendar design, which was more of our front end, our flat list, our divider, our header, and then meal pod rating implementation. This was more all of my Firebase research and the command line printouts that you saw in the demonstration. What I plan to focus on next sprint is I'm going to have to work more on the calendar design, or the calendar screen itself. So there might be a little bit more going towards the calendar design, but I'm really planning on finishing up that Firestore backend and figuring out how that works, and get it all displayed and looking good by the end of the sprint. I have, looks like 12.5 hours here. For some reason on my timesheet, it's marked as like 10.5. I don't know if there was like hidden hours that I didn't see. I went based off of this, so I apologize if this isn't reflective of that, but I hope that's acceptable. I thought I did 12 hours based on this here. But anyways, that is my application. I talked about our division of roles. I talked about our demonstrated our application. I talked about the GitHub code and some of the challenges that I faced. And then finally, I went on to Team Gantt to talk about the previous sprint features and the next ones I want to work on. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you in class.